Hello everyone, this is Rajarshi Palit, PGT Economics from JNB Birbhum. Today in this presentation we are going to discuss about financial sector reforms in India, the learning objectives. The learners will be able to state the problem in the financial sectors of India. The learner will be able to explain the impact of excessive control of interest rates in the economy. The learners will explain why banks were nationalized in India. The learners will be able to explain the mechanism through which financial sector reforms were implemented in India. So, financial sector reforms meant the reforms in areas like commercial banks, investment banks, stock exchange, and foreign exchange market. The financial sector comprises of all these four entities: commercial banks, investment banks, stock exchange, and foreign exchange market. The financial sector in India is controlled by the Reserve Bank of India. Reserve Bank of India is the apex banking authority in our country. Now, the Reserve Bank of India was founded on 1st April 1935 in Kolkata. So, the main objective of the establishment of the Reserve Bank of India was to have a controlling authority over all the commercial banks and financial institutions of the country. Now, it was the year 1969 when all the commercial banks in India were nationalized. The idea behind the nationalization of commercial banks was to ensure that the banking sector could cater to the requirement of the common people and not just concentrate on the servicing of the interest of the capitalist people of the country. So that is why the government nationalized the banks, the commercial banks in India in 1969. One of the major aims of financial reforms in India was to ensure that RBI worked as a regulator rather than a controller. The main idea of reforms was that RBI should become a regulator rather than being a controller of the financial sector of the country. Now, what prompted financial sector reforms in India? That means, what were the reasons that brought about financial sector reforms in our country? So, these are some points. The number one point is administered interest rates. Now, before the reforms were introduced in the financial sector in India, the rates of interest were generally governed by the government of India. It was the government of India through the Reserve Bank, the rates of interests were decided. The commercial banks, they did not have any say in the determination of rates of interest, and the government also ensured that some specific sectors were given relaxations in the rates of interest. So the rates of interest were not determined by the forces of demand and supply, and they were fixed by the government. Second was lack of competition. Since all the banks in India, all the commercial banks in India were nationalized, and foreign banks or private sector banks were not allowed to function, that's why they had no competition at all. The next point was low internal and managerial efficiency. Because of the control regime, these banks, the commercial banks, they lacked efficiency both internally as well as in terms of managerial skills. Next was high legal reserve ratios. Before the reforms of 1991, the cash reserve ratio and the statutory liquidity ratio were as high as 15% and 38.5%. We know that higher the CRR and SLR, lower is the lending capacity of the commercial banks, which results in higher rates of interest. So if the rates of interest are high, then borrowing becomes difficult, and if borrowing becomes difficult, it has its impact on investment. So high levels of legal reserve ratios resulted in very high rates of interest in the economy. And finally was political interference. Political interference also played a spoil sport for the banking sector, because they had to abide by the instructions that they often received from the government that were totally politically motivated rather than economically. Now, the mechanism of reforms. Narasimha Committee, which was formed to look into the reforms of the financial sector, suggested that the supervision in the banking sector should be strengthened. Rather than controlling, supervision should be more effective. RBI should be a facilitator rather than a controller. The RBI should facilitate proper functioning of the bank, issuing guidelines to the bank so that they could be more profitable rather than imposing regulations on the commercial banks from time to time. And finally was the deregulation of interest rates. In the reforms policy, it was suggested that the interest rates should be fixed by the forces of demand and supply rather than being fixed by the government. So, deregulation of interest rates resulted in the rates of interest coming down, encouraging borrowing and leading to higher levels of investment in the economy. So after reforms, what were the changes that came across? Financial sector reforms meant that the decisions could be taken on many issues without consulting the Reserve Bank of India. Now the banks, the commercial sector, they did not have to consult the Reserve Bank for each and everything. Under these changes, private banks were allowed to operate in India. They were given the freedom to start new branches. Foreign investment in banks could now be up to 50%. That means private banks were allowed to function and foreign investment was also allowed in the banking system in India for the first time. Foreign institutional investment such as merchant banks, pension funds were allowed to invest in the Indian financial market. That means these foreign institutional investors were also allowed to function or to invest in our stock exchange. The first private sector bank which started functioning in India after reforms was the IndusInd Bank, which came up in Mumbai in the year 1994. So we can see that after reforms, the private sector banks they came in, and because of the arrival of the private sector banks, the nationalized banks now started facing competition. The interest rates have become market driven with legal reserve ratios kept at levels that would encourage borrowings. Now, the legal reserve ratios have been brought down so that the banks have more loanable funds with them, which would bring the rate of interest down. However, non-performing assets are still a problem for the banking sector at large. Just to sum up, the financial sector comprises of commercial banks, investment banks, stock exchange, and foreign exchange market. All the commercial banks were nationalized in India in 1969. Then, one of the major aims of financial reforms in India was to ensure that RBI worked as a regulator rather than a controller. Rates of interest are market driven now and investor friendly. Now the rates of interest are market driven and are more investor friendly in our country. However, NPAs are still a problem to the banks in India. Now, some questions for assessment. Question number 1. When and where was the Reserve Bank of India founded? What were the reasons behind introduction of reforms in the financial sector in India? Next, name the committee and its suggestions for financial sector reforms in India. And finally, can you explain the reason behind deregulation of interest rates in India? So after going through this presentation, I hope the idea of financial sector reforms in India would be clear and you will be able to answer questions from this section of the chapter very easily in the board exams. So I wish you all the best. Thank you.